Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to introduce PHP and go through to get a basic understanding of what it is, where it fits inside of web application development, and some of the basics so we can start working with it here. So we'll go through a few slides here, about 9 in total, with actual content on it anyway, and talk through some of the same concepts. A lot of this stuff you're going to be already familiar with. You might not have worked with PHP before, but in the other programming languages that you've had, you'll find a lot of similarities. So when we talk about loops and functions and arrays and everything, so we won't have to really spend a whole lot of time on those. Just looking at if there's any syntactic or syntax differences in this language between other languages you're familiar with, and then once we get through that, I've got another sample file uploaded in order for us to look at and again work with the language a little bit. Apply all the real basic concepts here today that we've talked about in that file, in that sample code. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. First of all, what is PHP? Well, PHP itself is kind of a weird acronym. It stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. What it really means to us is it's a very common, very popular open source server-side language. It's server-side, and so up until this point we have predominantly been focusing on the client side. That is the code that is sent back to the browser for the browser to understand and to execute. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. PHP then is executed on the server side. And so we write applications, and to get truly dynamic applications, we write them in conjunction with the client side and the server side code. Server side, since it executes on the server, it can do things that we can't do on the client side. It can write to the file system, it can connect to databases and store data and insert data, as well as read data and send it back. So it's what makes our applications truly dynamic and interactive. There are several very popular content management systems and frameworks that are built off of PHP. WordPress is probably the most dominant. Drupal's another one that's relatively popular. Lots of frameworks out there, Yi and some of the others. We'll talk about MVC frameworks here next week, I think. How you can identify that you're working with a PHP file, and we've already done this when we first set up our LAMP stack. We went ahead and created that index.php file, and for the most part, that's what we're looking for in the application. A .php file extension tells the web server that it needs to first, before it can send that file, the contents, they send a response back from a request, it needs to run that file through the PHP processor and execute any PHP code that's inside of that. The response that is sent back, though, is plain HTML, JavaScript, plain text, right? The PHP code is ran, it's written, and it's stored, and it's executed on the server side. And so it's never sent back to the client. The only time it's sent back to the client is if somebody's made a mistake and messed up their application somehow, right? So it's executed on the server, and what's sent back to the client is a normal HTML document, right? Because the browsers do not understand PHP. They understand HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so we use that PHP to dynamically generate part of our response, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, that is sent to the user, sent to the client. All right, so as I mentioned, the why is that it truly makes our applications dynamic. We can save data, we can persist data, we can interact with other third-party services, Facebook, APIs, and Twitter, and a wide variety of things. Websites that don't include some sort of an ability to interact with a server-side component like this, they're just very limited in functionality. It's widely supported on a variety of web servers, any of the most popular web servers out there. Apache and IIS are probably the two most dominant. And Nginx is up there as well, and maybe, well, no, I don't think it's more popular than Apache. So it's well supported, and so you typically can write an application in PHP, and you're not have to be too concerned about the server environment that you run it on. I mean, there is a difference in running it on IIS versus Apache, but as far as the application's concerned, we don't have to be too concerned about that. It's relatively straightforward, relatively easy to learn. There's nothing too crazy in the syntax or the language itself. There are, of course, challenges that any language poses, but it's nothing crazy. And so you'll find, I think, that your experiences in your Java programming will help if that's the only background you have with a language, and you'll find a lot of similarities here. All right, so to jump right into how we can use PHP, then in order for any document to include PHP, and think back to that initial index file that we created, we had to have a less than $PHP and then a question mark greater than, these characters right here. We had to have those two in our document because those indicate then to the PHP processor that what's in between those two tags is actually PHP. That's how we differentiate in that file what's PHP code and what's everything else, that everything else being HTML, CSS, and or JavaScript. All right, we can place these anywhere in our file, anywhere in our page, and when the interpreter, when that page is requested, that code will be executed before it's returned back to the client. Okay, often end with a PHP extension. And so what we have in our PHP files then is really becomes a combination of everything. We have HTML, you have CSS, you can have JavaScript, as well as then the actual PHP code. PHP statements, much like our JavaScript, and again, you're going to even see between PHP and JavaScript, you're going to see a lot of similarities. PHP statements end with a semicolon, and so you have to remember your basic syntax, the basic rules of the language, and if you forget to end a statement with a semicolon, you'll probably generate a syntax error. Comments, just like with JavaScript, you can have 2 forward slashes for a single line, and you can have a / **/ / for block level, which means that comment will span anything between those two tags, will become or can become a multi-line comment. So definitely some similarities there. The keywords in PHP are not case sensitive, and so while it's not best practice to make them to do like echo statements or if statement, the if keyword or the else keyword in all caps, it's not going to matter if you do decide to or make that mistake there. Variable names are case sensitive. All right, so what are not case sensitive? If, else, while, those keywords, classes, functions, etc. But variable names are, and we'll take a look at an example or a sample of that here in the sample page that we're going to take a look at. Right, so case sensitivity, as with any language, can be an issue. This isn't like the punctuation or not the punctuation, but the indentation doesn't matter here. So just like with HTML or with JavaScript, if you have multiple spaces between things like the variable name and the equal sign, that's not a problem. So how do we declare a variable? Well, with PHP, we actually use the $. And so here's an example of declaring a variable named myvar and assigning it a string value of hello world. So you can see here that we simply had to start this variable with a $. There's no var keyword. There's no data type keyword in front of it, just $, and then the name of the variable. And then we assign it a value. And then again, semicolon at the end to make sure we don't generate any syntax errors. So variables are pretty straightforward. What you need to realize or understand with variables, just like with JavaScript, they're loosely typed. And so with that previous statement, that previous example, you didn't declare the type. I didn't say that this is an int variable. I didn't say int $myvar or bool $myvar. Because just like with JavaScript, what PHP will do is it will determine the type of that variable based off of the values that have been assigned to it. And PHP does that automatically for us. Again, you may have seen in other languages, including Java, where you have to declare the type. You have to say this is a variable that is a type of an integer, or a boolean, or a char, or a string, or something along those lines. But with PHP, just like with JavaScript, you don't do that. Scope is another big issue. And again, I don't think you'll find any real deviation here in scope from other languages. Our primary scope that we're dealing with is local and global. Variables that have a local scope, it's because they're defined within a function, or they're defined within a loop, or they're defined within a variable, or not a variable, but like an if statement or something, some control structure. And so the scope of that variable then is where it's been defined. That's really what we're talking about. If it's defined within a function, its scope is within the function. If it's defined within an if statement, that scope is within that if statement. Global then are variables that are declared outside of that function, because then any other function, because that was declared outside of a function, any other function can access that variable, right? So that's the two primary differences there. And again, I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with the difference between local and global. The third one, and this one is a little bit more, I shouldn't say it's more unique to PHP, but static is the third one. And so what we have with static then is that it's an ability within your code to keep a variable alive after it's gone out of scope. So the normal process for a variable is that once that variable has gone out of scope, let's say you call a function, in that function you declare that variable. Once that function returns, that variable has gone out of scope. So typically it gets deleted, it gets removed. But if you declare something static, then that just simply keeps that variable alive longer than or beyond when it's gone out of scope. Right? So if you see the static keyword, and we won't need to do much with the static keyword, it's just really just there for your essay, situational awareness, that it does exist. But if you see static, then that's the idea behind it, is that once that variable would normally go out of scope, with static, it keeps it alive. All right, with data types, these are the primary data types that we work with within PHP. String, integer, float, boolean, array, object, and null. Again, you're going to see a lot of similarities here with JavaScript, so I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time here. Strings are just any combination of characters. You usually see a string value assigned inside the double quotes. Integer then is a whole numeric value. That means it has no decimal place. Float is kind of like, it's like a double, and that you can have not only the integer, what's left of the decimal, but you can also have decimal places with a float. Booleans, simply true and false, but we can use the true and false keyword instead of 0 or 1. We'll talk a little bit about arrays. Arrays are really no different in PHP than they are in any other language. It's a single variable that can hold multiple values. Objects can get pretty heavy. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about objects when we move into the MVC portion of the course, but we won't spend too much time there. Again, I believe everybody was supposed to take 150 to take this course. That was the prereq, so you should have been introduced to object-oriented design in 150. And then null. Null simply meaning that a value doesn't exist or a variable doesn't exist. So oftentimes you find yourself checking for null values, because if you try to do something on a variable that has a null value, it'll oftentimes generate an exception or an error in the code, because null is nothing. You can't do something on nothing. All right, so basic control structures, and I'm really just wanted to highlight these. Again, you're going to find that they're almost identical to other languages. We can create if else branches, or statements in which we're testing conditions or multiple conditions with multiple branches of logic. We have an if statement. If's our keyword. Remember, this is case insensitive, but typically we type those in lowercase, all lowercase, and then we have the condition. And so that condition can use any sort of logical operators that we need. Equality, double equals. You can look for greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, less than, equal to, not equal to, true, false, right? No matter what statements you put in here, ultimately what this condition needs to be is true or false. While loops are also very similar. We have the while keyword, and the only reason that's capitalized is because of PowerPoint. I didn't realize that PowerPoint capitalized that on me. They should be all lowercase, and if I had PowerPoint on the system, I'd fix it right now, but I can't because I've only got the read-only. I don't have the Office suite on here. So that should be a lowercase while, but because it's case insensitive, it doesn't really technically matter. It'll still be valid syntax. While condition is true, and so whatever you put inside of here as your condition, then this code block will loop as long as this is true. All right. So typically with a while loop, you set up that condition outside of the loop, and then something inside of the loop eventually makes that false. For loops, very similar. We have the for statement. Again, same problem with capitalization on the word for, the keyword for. Inside of the parens, then we'll initialize the counter, we'll have our continuation test, and then we'll have our counter, increment, decrement. And so the nice thing about a for loop versus a while loop is that everything that controls the iterations is defined here where the loop is defined. With a while loop, it's a little bit different, and that typically something inside of the loop, we have to change a value of a variable or change whatever we're using this condition so that it is eventually false. Right? If we don't make our loops eventually false, if we don't make this condition eventually false, our loops never end. And most of the time, we don't want infinite loops. The last one, and this one is a little bit more unique to PHP. I mean, there are other languages that have it, but not every language has the for each loop. For each loops are great because they allow you to iterate over elements of an array, and it works only on arrays. And we'll go through an example here to show you exactly how that for each loop works. All right, so functions. We'll talk about, or we'll define a couple of very basic functions here. Very similar in definition and purpose as JavaScript, and again, as other languages. We use the function keyword in order to define a function. So, as an example, function is our keyword here. So we say function, the name of the function, and then if there are any arguments. As with JavaScript, we don't define the return type, right? Because functions can return values. They don't have to return a value, but they can return a value. And in some languages, when a function returns a value, you define the return type. But because PHP is loosely typed, just like JavaScript, we don't do that. So we just have the function keyword and then the name of the function. Arguments are from 0 to n. In general, you want to try to limit the number of your arguments, because the more arguments you have, typically the more that function then is trying to do. And we want to keep our functions relatively small as well. It's just kind of the bigger picture theoretical, how do I define, how do we create functions? Number of arguments then, name, and then the parentheses. And inside of the parentheses then is the code that will be executed when that function is invoked or when that function is called. As with variables on our arguments, you do not define a type. You simply define the arguments. So you define the number and whatever you want to call them. So it's almost like declaring a local variable, but in our arguments list. You do have to use the $sign. So the one problem here, I didn't intend this to be an actual argument. I just meant that to be the conceptually the placeholder for arguments. But when you define your arguments, just like with a variable, it's the $sign. So it's $sign and then the name of the argument. One other thing that you can do with PHP that is oftentimes handy is to define default values. And so if you define an argument here called test, you can say test equals 0. That way, it makes that argument optional. So if somebody wants to invoke this function and not provide a value, then test will take a default value of 0. Right? So you may see that sometimes in code that you look at or use yourself if you find a use for it. Otherwise, when you invoke that function, someone calls that function, they need to provide a value for that argument. Okay. As I mentioned, return values. When we want to return a value from a function in PHP, we use the return keyword. You can return scalar values, integers, booleans, floats, strings. You can return objects. You can return arrays. And so, if you need a function to return more than one value at a time, you're going to have to use something like an object or an array. Okay. Last thing we'll talk about then are arrays themselves. And what is the primary purpose of an array? Just a little bit of a review in case it's been a while since you've thought about or even worked with an array. Well, the primary purpose is to store multiple values in a single variable. If we didn't have that capability, we could use objects. If we didn't have objects and we didn't have arrays, we'd have to declare a bunch of variables. And so that becomes very inefficient. Variables then allow us to store multiple values in a single variable. With PHP, which is sometimes different than other languages, especially lower level languages like C or C++, you can store values of different types in a single array. With C, you declare types because it's strongly typed. You declare your type of an array. So let's say that I create a char array, then every element in that array has to be a char. With PHP, you don't do that. You declare it as an array, and then you can then store any type of value in any element of an array. So I could store a string, then a numeric, then an object, then another array, then a string. It doesn't matter. You have to be careful though, because oftentimes what we do put in arrays are objects of the same type that are somehow related, right? If they're all numeric values because it's all of the lab scores, for a grading program. Right, so most of the time the elements are related in some way, because oftentimes with arrays, we're going to iterate over them. We're going to iterate over the contents to do something. And so if we always have to test what the value is it an object, is it an array, is it a string, is it a numeric, it can make it challenging to work with those. There are 3 types of arrays, and if you start spending more time developing in PHP, you will use all 3 types here. Indexed arrays, these are probably the arrays that we were very first introduced to. It's an array with a numeric index. So we have elements, right? And that first element is at index 0. And don't forget that off by 1. That's, again, another common mistake that people make when you start first working with arrays, is that indexing, that you have the first element, but the actual index is index 0. And we'll see that. We'll refresh in the sample code here. So we store values in an array, and we get those values out by referencing that index, 0, 1, 2, 3. We reference a numeric value. The next one is called an associative array, and PHP developers love to use associative arrays. I love to use associative arrays. And what we have named keys. And so instead of referencing a value by a numeric index, we reference a value by a string index. So I could say that instead of the element at the first element at index 0 is some value, I can say that the first element at index 0, maybe I call it, I don't know, maybe it's the first customer. That's a terrible example. We'll look at some in the sample code here, and that'll add some clarity there. The last type of array then is the multidimensional array, and that is an array of arrays. You can have 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, whatever. That is that you have an array, and then each element in that array is another array. And then within that array, each element could be an array. And so you can do that pretty deep if you needed to. A little less common, 2-dimensional or maybe even 3-dimensional arrays aren't altogether uncommon, but not usually more than that, at least in my experience. So multidimensional arrays then are simply arrays that contain as their elements other arrays. All right, so that's the basics. That was kind of the crash course, intro to PHP. I uploaded a file to our course folder called introphp.php. And because this code needs to execute on the server, you can't download this to your desktop, double-click the file, and expect it to work. Now we absolutely have to have this on a server because we need the server. We need Apache because we installed PHP on Apache. We need that Apache server to execute this code dynamically. We need that to be able to run it through the PHP processor. So I downloaded this code to my virtual machine. I moved it into the HTML folder, which you can see right here. And then because I put this in htdocs, or I'm sorry, not htdocs, but var www.html, just like we did with the last couple of sample files, I can access that via localhost / intro to PHP. Right? So you can see here that there's the page. Let's see. To take a look at that page then, you can see we're pretty much going to walk through everything that we just talked about, but see it in code here. And so while, again, it may look like a lot, there really isn't a whole lot here. You can see this is a combination then of HTML. This is an HTML page. Here's our doc statement. Here's an HTML. There's the head. Here's the body. There's the closing body, and there's the closing HTML. Because I am printing content so that you can see it in this browser, you do see that I put all of my PHP with any of these echo statements inside of the PHP tags. Right. So as I mentioned, less than question mark PHP, that defines, there's our opening, and you can see with something like Sublime Text, we've got this line drawn to help with that. Yep, and there's our closing. It might actually be for the I think that's actually for the HTML. So there's our closing tag. So everything inside of here is PHP. If we look at this page and we view the page source, you'll see that none of that PHP is returned. All we get is HTML, and in this case HTML, because there is no CSS or JavaScript associated with this particular page or document. Let's see. All right. So inside of the PHP then, inside of the tags, we can write PHP. So we have a single line comment. We have a multi-line comment, right? / ***. Anything in between those two tags is a block level comment, multi-line comment. We have variable definition, and the variable names can be, again, anything that you want. They need to start with a $sign, and there are some other rules that you'll run across. They need to be descriptive though. All right, they don't have to be, but they should be. They should be descriptive. The variable names inside of a real program should be descriptive of what the purpose of that variable is. You can see with this variable text, I assigned it a string value of hello world. Okay, string values have, they're usually double quotes or even single quotes, and it's just a combination of characters inside of those double quotes. So we can put anything that we want there. This is now the value of this variable. For the next one, $x = 5. So this would be a string. The type would be a string. The type of this would be integer, and then the type of this, $y = 10.5, would be a float because we have that decimal place there. All right, so that's how we define them. Right? Again, we don't have to say var. We don't have any keyword to declare a variable. We simply say $, and then the name of the variable. Right? So this is the first time I've used this in this code. This not only declares it, but it also initializes it to a value. Okay, the next section here then is the case insensitive. And so echo is a relatively common used function with PHP because it prints. it prints out. And so if we want to print this content here, hello world with an HTML tag, which is a break, then we can just say echo and then that string value. So we have echo all uppercase, echo all lowercase, echo all mixed case, and you can see here that there is no error. All right, it prints off hello world all 3 times. And not only does it print off hello world, but it also prints off the line break, which gets treated, as you can see here, as actual HTML. Okay. One thing that's probably important to point, it definitely is important to point out at this point, is syntax errors. What happens if you have a syntax error? Let's say that I made a mistake, and instead of typing echo, I just typed ECO, or I forgot my semicolon. Well, we'll save that page and we'll rerun it, and we'll see what happens here. Okay, we get a white screen, and if we go to view page source, we can see that we got nothing in this document. Nothing was returned. So sometimes affectionately dubbed the white screen of death, if you're familiar with the blue screen of death from the Windows days. What happened is we generated a syntax error, but we don't have any idea that we have a syntax error. You know, with JavaScript, we can open up the console and we can see those syntax errors, but this isn't JavaScript. This code is not executing in the browser, it's executing on the server. So what we need to do, and where this is typically located, right? You may find it different for your setup, but typically where this is located is there's a log file that whenever Apache encounters a syntax error, it logs it to this file. And so on my system, it's under var log Apache 2. So we're going to change to that directory, cd var log Apache 2, and you can see there's error.log. And so there is a helpful command called tail. And what tail will do, it will give us the end of that document. The way that Apache writes to the error log is chronological from the oldest to the newest being at the bottom. So it's just appending entries. And so if we do tail, you'll get a bunch of output. What we're looking for is essentially this little statement here that shows us the time. This tells us when the error occurred. So you can see this was the most recent one. So at the bottom of the file, we had a PHP parser error, unexpected something, right? So if we go to line 24, then that should help us to track down that error. And on line 24, we can see that we made a mistake in that echo. So if we fix that and go back, now our page is working again. Okay, all right, so don't forget about that. When you start to write PHP and you're having errors, this is the best place to go. Look in your error file. All right, let's see. Next section then, variables are case sensitive. And also what's unique about this is that we have the first time you use a variable, even if it hasn't been used before, you don't get an error because this is how we declare a variable. We just don't get a defined value. Right? So let's say that we define a variable called color, all lowercase, and I set it equal to the string value of red. Now we echo the value, this string value, this right here, which is a single dot, that is string concatenation with PHP. Right? So we'll print this value, or we've defined this string portion. We'll concatenate the value of color, and then we'll concatenate a line break. So that, or a BR tag, so that these print off on individual lines. Right? Color is this variable. So my car is, it should print out my car is red. This variable then is all uppercase. So this has not been used before. It has no value, so there's nothing for it to print. So we should see that my house is, and then no value here. The last one, color with some mixed casing. That is, we have some lowercase and uppercase. And again, we'll print off my boat is, and because we haven't declared this, we haven't used this before, we've assigned no value to it, it'll just print off nothing as well. So if we go back and refresh, and we look at that particular output, we can see my car is red, my house is, no value, and then my boat is, and again, no value. And so it doesn't generate any errors, even though we haven't used those variables before. This declares it, and it just has no value. So be careful on your case sensitivity of your variables. All right, the next little section here which is essentially this little group of code, we're going to talk about scope, defining functions, and calling functions. And again, it should all pretty much be review, but just to go through it and start to get a little bit of practice in working with PHP. So I've declared two variables, one called hello world, and again, watch the case because I did have an uppercase W here. So hello world has a value of hello world, local equals blue. Right, so these two right now have a global scope because they're declared outside of a function. Here's a function I've defined. So we have the function keyword. The function's name is print variable, and it has parentheses here with no arguments. Here are my curly brackets. So this is the code that's going to execute whenever this function is called. You can see that all this does is it declares or assigns some values to these variables, declares local to be global, and then prints. So we'll come back and go through that here in just a moment. What this is going to test then is we're going to print the value of local, then we're going to call, oops, that should have a, Okay, so I think I do need an argument. I must have deleted that by mistake. We'll print the variable with hello world, and then we'll echo local again, right? And we're gonna echo local and then echo local again because I'm going to treat local, even though I called it local, I should probably change the name to global. But because I declared that to be global inside of the function, it takes on a global scope. So that is something that's a little bit different with PHP. That is that even though I have declared these as a global scope, PHP won't actually treat them as a global unless you say they're global inside of the function, right? So local is blue, and I've declared it to be a global variable inside of the function. So what will happen is we'll print blue the first time, then we'll call print variable, and we don't need any arguments for this example. We'll call print variable, right? Because global, we've declared local to be global. Then we'll assign hello world to be green, and we'll also define local to be this is local. We'll print hello world, right? So we'll print green, and then we'll echo the value of local again. And so because it was global, what this should print, we assigned it a new value here. It should print this is local. So we should print blue, then green, then this is local. So let's save that file and let's see what happens. And before we do that, let me just go back and change. Let's just add some line breaks here so that that output that gets generated in the browser is just a little bit easier to read. All right, perfect. And there we go, blue, green, and now this is local. Okay, had I not declared this to be global here, then what would happen is that local, this would be treated as a local variable to this function. And so local is assigned blue, it'd be assigned this is local in here, but it would only be a local scope. And so when we got back to this, so we'd print it and then we'd print it again, it would have the same value. Right, so what we'll see here is it'll be blue, green, and now blue. Right, and there's our output, blue, green, and blue. Right, so even though we declare it with a global scope, in order to use it globally, we have to declare, have to add this global keyword to that variable. You'll also notice that with this function, we defined hello world to be hello world. And let me go ahead and add that to our print statement here. All right, so we declared it here. It's a global, but just like the previous example, because even though we change it here, I haven't declared it, I haven't given it that global keyword. And so we'll print it after we called the print variable function, and it'll maintain its same value. So now we'll have an echo, this is local, hello world. All right, the last little bit here, and then we'll wrap it up. is talking about arrays. Okay, so I mentioned that we have for arrays the array function to define an array. So here's a call to the array function. Once we call that, we're just defining the element values. So we could say, in this case, this array has 3 elements, and those elements are string values, 152, 52, 92. We could declare another array. Let's call it new array. And we could say it has values 1, 2, 3, 4. We could call this one mixed values, array 1, 2, 3, false, right? It doesn't matter. If I save that and refresh the page, we'll see that there are no errors. There are no syntax errors, so it's all valid syntax. Once we define these elements, then the first type of array that we talked about was the indexed array. And so we can put that inside of a loop. We can use a for loop. For loops are very appropriate for iterating over the contents of an array. You can say $i, so we have our counter initialization. So $i equals 0. We're starting at 0 because we want to access the first element of the array. And arrays start, their indexes start at 0. $i is less than 3 because this array has 3 elements. And I++. We're just going to increment our counter by 1 because we want to walk each element of that array. Okay, with this one then, I'll just simply print the value. So like we've done previously, or like I've been doing previously here, have echo the class is, then I concatenate to that string the value or the value from the element at this index. Right, so we have the name of the array classes. We use the square brackets, and then this value needs to be numeric to access that index. Okay, it needs to be positive. We don't have negative indexes in an array, and it needs to be within the number of elements that we have defined. So we have 3 elements for this array, so the only possible index values we can have are 0, 1, and 2. If we had 10 elements, it would be 0 through 9. If we had 1,000 elements, it would be 0 through 999. Right? Index starts at 0, and it's always 1 less than the total number of elements in the array. All right, and then after that, concatenate a line break tag. So if we're looking for output here, what we should see is 3 print statements because we're going to get 3 iterations of this loop. The class is 150, 250, and then 292. Okay, and there we go. There's our output. It's a little clunky here, so let me go back into here and get rid of this. There we go. Class is 150, class is 250, and the class is 292. Okay, so there's nothing too different about arrays of PHP. One that you may not have been introduced to then is the associative array, and it's very important to understand how this works because a lot of PHP developers use the associative array. With this then, instead of defining, here we defined a numeric value to access the index, right? 3 elements, index values can be 0, 1, 2. With associative arrays then, what we do is we define a string value, a name value, in order to access that particular element. So this is very similar to the previous example in that I have 3 elements in this array. But what we're doing then is I'm saying this is the key. The key is 150. And I use the equal sign greater than to define the value. Intro to programming. The key is 250. The value is more advanced programming. The key is 292. The value is web development. Right? So instead of accessing these elements going 0, 1, 2 using that numeric index value, I can now access them saying 292, 250, or 150. Whatever I put, right, if this is our statement here to define an element, whatever I put on the left side of this is the key that I use to access this value. Okay, so associative arrays in conjunction with the for each loop then become very, very handy. So now I have a for each loop. Remember, for each loops iterates over an array, over a collection, over an array, sorry. And so what I can say is, here's my array. I've defined it to have the value of class topics. And I say class topics as key value. $key equals greater than $value. And so what this does with each element in the array, it stores the key name in this variable and the value in this variable. And so we'll walk through this array, these 3 elements, and I'll print the value of key, and I'll print the value of value. Okay, and then just to make it a little bit easier to see, I'll append that line break. All right, so run this program again, and there you can see there's the key, 150, 250, 292. There's the value that corresponds to that key. 150 Intro to Programming, 250 More Advanced, 292 Web Development. Okay, if I want to access an individual element, then what I can do is I can say, we'll just call this a test. I could say class topics for 292. Okay, and that'll give me the value associated with that key, which will be web development. So we can save that, we can run it again, and there it is. Test, there's our value web development. Right? I could change that to 150. I could change that to 250. And then this is in contrast to doing something numerically. In contrast to saying, well, 292 is the third element, so that'd be the second index, and you can see it doesn't work. Okay, this is handy in a lot of ways, because then what happens is we can define, when we define it by index, we have to remember the order. I have to know that 150 was the first, 250 was the second, and 292 was the third. I have to know what each element, the value that is holding, and what that represents. With an associative array, I don't have to do that. I can say, well, I'm not sure what order. I don't actually have to care what order. But if I want the value, let's say that these are they're class topics, so I want the value for course 292, I just have to say 292, and it gives me the corresponding element value for that particular index. I don't have to remember that it's the third element. I just need to know what index and how I save those indexes. And so it makes it usually a little bit more efficient and a little bit more fun to work with arrays that way. So, all right, that was our introduction to PHP and some of the core constructs, control structures, working with functions and variables. We'll continue to do more with PHP. Right, so take some time, look at this code, get it to run on your VM, play around with it a little bit, make sure that you don't have any syntax errors, and that you're just generally starting to become a little bit more comfortable. You kind of understand how PHP works. As we get into the MVC, we're going to start working with an application framework that uses PHP, so we'll spend a lot more time with it. If you have any questions on anything, as usual, let me know. Otherwise, we'll pick up with the next material, which is, I'm drawing a blank on what it is. So I guess I'll just talk to you guys then. All right. Thanks.